Hello, everyone. Welcome to Talking Logistics, where we have conversations with thought leaders and newsmakers in the supply chain logistics industry. It's my great pleasure to welcome today's program Fab Braska, who's VP Solution Strategy at JDA Software. And today we're going to talk about the impact of Omni-Channel on logistics. Now, I don't know if there's a bigger buzz term or headline in the supply chain logistics industry today than Omni-Channel. Certainly, it's captivated the trade publications and analysts like myself for the past few years. And it's an area that a lot of supply chain logistics executives, both at retailers and manufacturers, continue to, wrap their arms around, trying to get their arms around it and trying to, evolve into this new operating environment. And when you're thinking about, what does it actually mean when you're talking about from a logistics perspective? What impact is Omnichannel having? I think that's a question that many in the industry have, and we're fortunate to have with us today Fab, who I've known for a very long time, and has a great pulse on what's happening in the industry with the variety of customers that he works with. So we're very fortunate to have him on the program. Part of our goal here at Talking Logistics is to make this conversational. So as Fab and I are having a conversation here, if you've got a question for Fab, you can do so via the Submit a Question button, and I'll keep an eye on it. And if it's a good and appropriate question and we've got time, I'll certainly try to weave it into the conversation. Also, if you are joining us as a visitor, you will have to sign in first with Spreecast in order to be able to ask a question. So with that, Fab, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Adrian. It's absolutely great to be here.
Fab, you and I go back a long time, but you're actually a first-time visitor here on Talking Logistics. So whenever I have a new guest on, I always like to give folks some perspective of where my guests come from, right? So why don't we start, before we kind of dive into the topic, with you telling us, briefly a little bit about your career path, how and why you got involved with supply chain logistics, and what your current role and responsibilities are there at JDA.
Sure. Pretty long career, not to give away my age, which is ever increasing. But I've been in supply chain for around 25 years. I have a background in mathematics. That was kind of my origin, and did some work in market research and as an analyst. But then I dove into the supply chain space, primarily in transportation. Was really my big focus, working for companies like Intertrans Logistics, which was acquired by I2. Spent a long time in technologies helping to drive and grow that transportation practice. And then more recently, we were acquired by JDA, and where I continue to lead that practice, but now have a much more expanded role in driving our strategy on what we call intelligent fulfillment, which is really looking at collapsing the worlds of planning and execution. So you think about execution solutions like transportation and warehouse and order management, and how they interact and relate to traditional upstream supply chain planning capabilities like forecasting and replenishment. So that's my current responsibility at JDA. So it's been a long career, a lot of fun, travel the world, and get to talk to a lot of my fellow thought leaders about some pretty interesting topics.
Great, great career path, and certainly, again, like you said, you and I go back a long time, and you've been involved with many aspects of supply chain management over that time. So let's talk about Omnichannel now, and like I said in my opening remarks, it continues to generate a lot of buzz in the industry. As a way to start, perhaps at a high level, how would you characterize the state of Omnichannel today? What's real and what's still kind of hype?
Yeah, it's a really good question and broad question. A couple of points I want to make there. One is, we use the term omni-channel. The real, I think, issue that everyone is tackling is what I like to call consumer centricity, right? It's the growth in the power that the consumer has. That's essentially what everything is driving towards, right? Is how do we now service that individual consumer, right? The individuals as opposed to masses or groups. And, we think about that in terms of omni-channel because we're developing all these different paths to do that. But really, that's what's at the heart of it. In terms of kind of the reality, organizations are executing against it. You're seeing different strategies emerge. Obviously, everyone talks about Amazon, but you're seeing a lot of the other we always think of it in terms of retail, but different retailers adopting different strategies, and ultimately consumers are getting the goods that they want. I think the bigger question, and this is where, to the way you phrase it, what's the reality versus hype, is consumers are getting what they want, but at what cost, right? What's it costing the retailer? What's it costing the manufacturer? What's the complexity? What's the hit rate? How many late and lost shipments are, how many out of stocks are consumers getting? That's where we need to kind of figure out what's the reality of this initiative, of this kind of wave of evolution.
No, that's a great point. When I talk about this subject matter, particularly from a transportation perspective, I mean, it wasn't that long ago where 3-day delivery was kind of revolutionary, right? And then the bar was set with free shipping, right? And we all know that free shipping there's no such thing as free shipping. Somebody ultimately has to pay UPS and FedEx and USPS, right? And then the bar was raised even higher now with, some of the activities you're seeing now with same-day delivery, right? And hour delivery. You can point to Amazon as kind of driving, some of that. But I think there's a lot of experimentation taking place right now. And to your point, some of these things are being done, but, at what cost, and are they doing it in the most efficient and smartest way possible, which I think is with where a lot of folks are kind of struggling with right now to understand, is there a better way in terms of us moving forward to try to, respond to, these changing and more demanding customer expectations that they're facing out there. Now, when people think of OmniChannel, they generally think about retailers, right? And they think about consumers, obviously, because we're the ones that are driving a lot of this. But OmniChannel is also impacting manufacturers, right?
Absolutely. And I would think about that in a couple of different ways. One is, from the standpoint of, well, the manufacturer is the retailer is a consumer of the manufacturer, right? The customer of the manufacturer. So, when you think about getting the right inventory in the right place in order to fulfill that individual consumer need, right? Ultimately, the manufacturer plays an important role on that and making sure that the goods are coming and being dispersed and deployed in the right places. But at the same time, also, they play a more direct role. So you think in certain sub-industries, and actually, let me take a pause for a second, and I'll come back to the rest of the answer. But back to our original point around reality and hype, the other thing you have to think about this topic is it varies a lot by sub-industry, right? So if you think about the complexities and the approach to OmniChannel, for example, for fashion and apparel, it's very different than consumer electronics. So that plays a really, important role as well. And tying that to my current answer, if you think about, let's say, consumer electronics, well, obviously, the manufacturers need to supply the retail outlets and the way they look at fulfilling consumer demand. But a lot of manufacturers are going direct to consumer as well. So they have their own multi-channel strategy. And then you add in the mix the whole idea of drop shipping. Right, where it might be through a retailer or through, an e-commerce site, but it's actually being shipped direct from manufacturers. So all of those things come together and create another set of complexity just specific to our manufacturing friends. And don't forget the 3PLs, the third-party logistics providers that have to make a lot of this move. So they have their own challenges. So it really affects everybody.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, I think, the reality is, just to kind of underscore what you just said, is, this has a ripple effect that, starts with the consumer, but it ripples out not just to the retailers, but the suppliers, the carriers, logistics service providers, really the whole ecosystem, involved in across all these different industries. So let's focus now on how OmniChannel is impacting logistics, starting with distribution centers, right? So let's start there, and then we'll talk about transportation, and then
Sure.
down to the store level. I mean, how is OmniChannel changing the role, the design, the processes that take place within a distribution center?
Yeah, and I think as we move down the line in terms of looking at different pieces, I think you'll see some commonality of themes. And starting at the warehouse, I mean, the real big thing is you're moving from an environment, and again, let's kind of talk about the general retail environment where you're shipping to store. You're moving from pallets and filling trucks and shipping pallets to stores to now still doing that, but now having to fulfill eaches, right? So the onesies and twosies, and that requires, different stocking patterns and, different locations, different labor resources, different skill sets from a labor perspective. You've got the complexity of returns, which is a whole nother world, and again, very specific to certain sub-industries. You might have additional activities around kitting, and packaging and sorting and kind of repackaging into shippable units. There's just a whole myriad set of activities that you just don't have to worry about when you're just shipping, again, pallets of stuff to stores. So really that now has transformed and really created an increased focus on throughput and efficiency. So the interactivity for the person in the warehouse, the streamlining of those activities, their interaction becomes that much more important because they have more and newer things to do.
When it comes to distribution centers, I mean, I think that we did an episode earlier this year with one of your colleagues talking about workforce labor management
Yes.
in the warehouse and the impact OmniChannel is having there. And I think for some folks, what we talked about there is that there's this perception that, it's just going to be, you just put in a lot of automation and, labor is going to go away, right? But in reality, it doesn't necessarily go away. And in some places, it increases if you don't have the right systems in place, the labor component of it. I mean, do you concur with your colleague's opinion there?
Oh, absolutely. Anytime, I mean, it's nice to think that you could automate everything, but we know that doesn't necessarily happen. And that doesn't go through all sizes of companies as well. You have to factor that in. And the reality is there are new tasks, new skills. Again, let's take a specific example of returns, right? And having to deal with that issue in the warehouse. I need to take the returns in. I need to triage them. I need to restock and repackage where possible. I need to, throw things into waste where possible. I have to do all that work. These are all new tasks and new skills that I need to intermingle with all the other things that my labor already engages in.
Now, are you seeing, some of the companies that you work with, I mean, kind of this having an effect on the way they look at their distribution network in terms of taking a step back and saying, do we need to change our network in terms of where we have distribution centers and how we flow product between, let's say, either the distribution centers to our stores or between our suppliers to our distribution centers? And, obviously, parcel shipping is playing a greater role in terms of, how do you design these facilities to be able to handle the traditional channels of pallets to stores and the kind of the e-commerce channels? I mean, are those being separate distribution centers, or are you seeing companies trying to do those two operations under the same roof? Yeah,
Lots of parts to that question. I'll try to kind of tackle them in pieces. First, I think, again, to a point I made earlier, it's very dependent upon sub-industry, right? So certain sub-industries will have more significant or lesser implications of all this. Second, I think size and scale also matters. So if you're a local, or geographically centric, retailer, maybe fashion retailer, you're going to have a different set of challenges than, a traditional big box, say, home improvement, right? And different challenges and then different capabilities as well in terms of how you can enable this consumer centricity. So I think we're seeing a lot of different things emerge, and most definitely there isn't a one size fits all. So I can talk about some things that we generally see, particularly with our leading customers, but there isn't a one size fits all. You can't kind of put everyone in a box. Some of the things that we do see and certainly try to advocate is, looking at things holistically and trying to use the network you have to its maximum effect. So, instead of, for example, where a lot of people started, particularly in North America, where they might have a specific e-fulfillment distribution center, or even part of a distribution center focused just on e-fulfillment, right? Well, maybe they should use their stores, right, to get closer to the consumer. right? But that's again is going to have what's going to have an impact there is how big is that retailer? What's their coverage? So we're seeing retailers take different kind of tacks in terms of their network. I think the big thing that we're seeing, again, tying to your original question, is there's been a shift from retailers just trying to fulfill to the individual consumer and to more of one now understanding, okay, what's the real cost of it and what is my flexibility? How can I now start to take out that latency and deal with the financial impact that this strategy is having? So that there's almost that kind of the reality is really kind of coming home now, and a lot of organizations are really trying to focus on that, and to varying levels of success.
Yeah, no, great point. Obviously, there is no one size fits all solution, if you will, or approach to, addressing these omni-channel challenges. But I think, as you said, there is that high level objective in terms of looking at it. Are we doing it as smart a way as possible, right? In terms of being able to do it cost effectively. Let's shift gears now and talk about, transportation. Omni-channel is obviously raising the role and importance of parcel shipping, for both retailers and manufacturers. I mean, what challenges is this kind of increased role of parcel having on transportation operations, and what else? What other factors come into play, from a transportation standpoint?
Again, a long list of answers. There's lots of things. And a couple of things. Here we talk about, again, because of the consumer centricity, right? We talk about now last mile logistics, right? That's the buzzword everyone talks about. The challenge right there is that term itself has multiple meanings depending on what sub-industry you're talking about. Last mile could be the UPS and FedEx person coming to your house. Last mile could also be you owning your own assets and creating, delivery routes and doing real, instead of abdicating routing, you doing it yourself, right? Like maybe in a grocery environment. So the challenges change depending upon, again, what sub-industry you're trying to solve. A couple of the things I think a lot of companies are struggling with. One is parcel as a mode is, particularly, again, if you're a traditional large retailer, not a mode you're usually familiar with, right? You're usually familiar with, less than truckload, and I'm loading pallets and getting those to my docks. I'm not thinking about pick, pack, and shipping eaches, let alone dealing with the rate structures and, all the myriad service levels that you get when you start to deal with those modes. Add into that potentially couriers when you start to get into, store delivery and dealing with the impact of that. So just dealing with that as a mode is a challenge, from a rating perspective, cost perspective, service trade-off perspective. Then there's connectivity. As you know, and you probably, like me, you do buy a lot of stuff online. Having visibility to where the package is a big deal, right? Especially when it's crunch time near Christmas or whatever milestone, and you want to know where it is. And when you start dealing with so many providers and smaller providers, sometimes getting that connectivity and that visibility becomes a challenge, right? Again, the big guys, have that, I think, well in hand. But when you start dealing with smaller participants and a myriad of them, that gets to be, that's another challenge. And then I think, the last thing I'll comment on there, too, is, particularly with larger networks where I might have combinations of fulfillment, right? Maybe I'm shipping to consumer. Maybe I'm shipping from store. Maybe I'm trying to get inventory from a fulfillment center to a store for consumer pickup. Well, then it becomes more important not to silo the transportation and just assume everything's going to go parcel, right? If I've already got a replenishment move going to my store, why can't I throw a bunch of consumer orders on it and just take advantage of essentially sunk costs? So that raises another challenge because now you need to think about it in terms of all your other modes. So again, lots of impact to help to deal with these this kind of evolution.
Yeah, no, that's a great example there at the end in terms of being able to kind of take that more holistic perspective, particularly when parcel wasn't part of wasn't front and center as it's becoming. In fact, that was one of my, I put together my predictions for 2016, and I came up with 8 altogether, and one of the 8 was that parcel was going to basically come out of the shadows and, play a more important role for companies in the industry for a lot of the reasons that you just talked about there. Shifting now to stores. I mean, stores historically has been a place where you and I go to buy products, and now they're serving as, mini fulfillment centers, right? Mini warehouses. And you talked about, even when you think about parcel shipping, I mean, you've got retailers that are shipping consumer orders from the stores, so they need shipping, partial shipping capabilities at the store level, which, doesn't exist or hasn't existed historically. So that's a challenge there. So when you look at this new operating and new role for stores, I mean, how is this new reality impacting store operations?
Well, this is a real exciting area. And again, some similar themes. But boy, when you really start to think about it, just a lot of complexity. So just some of the things that you talked about, you've got now new tasks that can occur at a store that maybe they didn't have to deal with before. Picking, packing, shipping, right? These are new activities that you have to have the right staffing for, you have to have the right training for in order to enable. You have to make decisions around, do you have a model where you have associates picking from the shelf to go and ship and fulfill, local orders, or, are you going to try to incent consumers to come pick up in store and have a dedicated area? Extending from that, and the big thing that I think a lot of retailers are struggling with is, well, then how do you deal with the inventory? So if I have a scenario where I'm looking to pick from shelf in order to fulfill online demand, as an example, well, now I'm taking inventory away from that consumer that's coming into my store. So how do I deal with the forecasting of that? How do I, make sure that I'm carrying the right levels at the right time to be able to account for both? And when you think about the variability involved, in particular with online orders, that's a tough problem. If you think about the challenges around a dedicated pickup area, right? If you don't think through the right capacity, and I'll give you a personal example. I did this to myself. I'm guilty of this. I ordered something for my boys. I think I ordered a game or something along those lines. I reserved it in the store. They had a dedicated pickup area. I went to the store. I saw a long line. And guess what I did? I went to the shelf to see if it was there. It happened to be. I grabbed it, went to the regular checkout, got out fast. And so, great for me. I'm the consumer. I got what I wanted ultimately, but think of the impact to the retailer. Now, the inventory that they had allocated may still be allocated, right? So I consumed it from somewhere else. So now they have a mismatch. And, yes, I'm a satisfied consumer, but it might be dissatisfying someone else, that next person that went to the shelf and maybe that unit's not in stock. So a lot of complexity there when you think about the forecasting and replenishment now of that inventory.
No, absolutely. And then, when you try to look at it, a lot of what supply chain management is about is kind of the trade-offs between, transportation costs, inventory costs, labor costs. And when you look at something like, some of the examples you just gave in terms of replenishment decisions, or when you look at the cost of labor at the store level versus the cost of labor to fulfill from our traditional distribution center, right? There's a lot of differences there, and trying to get that holistic, view, is obviously, challenging here with these new permutations of possibilities that the, companies have right now in terms of getting products from point A to, point B. And obviously this is a place where technology plays a role. Obviously you work at JDA and have solutions in this area. I mean, what impact is OmniChannel having on things like transportation management systems, warehouse management systems, warehouse labor management, and the other applications that kind of, provide the technology foundation to be able to do some of these things?
Yeah, I think, that's a really good, obviously a very important question, because, technology ultimately is going to help enable kind of the next generation and more sophisticated strategies, particularly in some of the things that we've just talked about. I think here, and you'll notice, especially in my what we just talked about with the store, you notice I brought up a lot of supply chain concepts. And, what we're seeing from a technology perspective is, when this wave started to really emerge, and the evolution, I would almost say revolution happened, and by the way, it's not over. I think it's ever evolving. There was a lot of focus from a technology perspective at the consumer end, that consumer interaction, right? Being able to have consumers have a great experience and be able to buy things online. And more, tying into our original opening discussion, retailers and manufacturers are starting to understand that ultimately you can make that great promise and give them that great experience, but if you don't get the product there in a cost-effective way for you, you have a breakdown, right? It has to be profitable. It has to be about business ultimately. And so a lot of that, when you narrow it down, is all about getting the right product in the right place at the right time. These are the supply chain basics. So where we focused a lot of our efforts at JDA is how do we bring those two worlds together? So, we have execution-centric solutions like transportation, warehousing, store operations, our relationship with IBM for order management. On the execution side, and they're very powerful, and have the ability to deal with both with eaches and with bulk moves. But how do you tie that to supply chain planning to really do two things? One is to lower that latency, right, in decision making, but probably more importantly, how do you use that execution level detail to make the decisions that you're making upstream much more intelligent, and hence eliminating some of these challenges and some of these bottlenecks ahead of time, right? So think about, kind of clearing up the clogs in the arteries and making sure that the blood flows smoothly. I think when supply chains, in the previous incarnations, it was okay to have some blips or some clogs because the supply chains had operated at a little bit of a different level. Now with consumer centricity, the variability is through the roof, the speed is through the roof, or the speed required is through the roof. And so the little imperfections that we tolerated before, we can't tolerate now. So it's really our supply chain or technology innovators, the onus is on us now to create interactions that are the next generation that remove those imperfections and really have supply chains operating at an efficiency that we haven't seen before.
As you were talking there, I mean, it reminded me of kind of when one of the things I've been hearing a lot about from supply chain executives over the past few years, and it's certainly something that I've been on my soapbox in the talks that I've given recently, is really this need to make smarter decisions faster, right? Because of everything that's happening, whether it's on the consumer side or changes that are happening on the regulatory front or with trade agreements, competitive moves, you name it, right? There's so much dynamic. It's such a dynamic environment that companies really need to put themselves in a position to make quote unquote smarter decisions faster. And what does that mean, right? We can have a whole conversation on that. But I think what it ultimately dictates is that people have to finally walk the talk on breaking down the silos that exist organizationally, as well as from a technology standpoint, right? Because I think in many cases, these systems have operated in silos, right? And then it's about tossing data from the TMS to the WMS, right? But it was just that, right? It was just tossing data back and forth. I mean, is OmniChannel kind of serving as a catalyst for companies, number one, to break down the silos organizationally, and number two, for technology providers such as yourself to enable, truly more holistic decision making and processing between these different what has historically been point solutions?
Great question, and there's two things I really want to kind of talk through there that are really important. So one is, from a technology perspective, one of kind of everyone who does what we do, you have your own personal soapboxes, and one of them for me is it's not just about integration, and certainly our strategy isn't just about integration. It has to be about the graying of, or the blurring of lines between these, in this case, functional silos. So I need my transportation solution to be warehouse aware. I need my, fulfillment or replenishment solution to understand labor capacity and space capacity. So it's not just about dumping information back and forth. There has to be an intelligence built into that space itself to be able to consume that and make these better decisions. So that's one side of it. You raised a beautiful point, again, another one close to my heart, which is the organizational structure side of it. And, you and I both come from, we have our transportation background, and I remember, back in the day, walking into customers and talking about, for example, combining inbound and outbound, right, to create continuous moves. If you have your, trucks, your own fleet going to, your customers, wouldn't it be great to go and do, local supply pickup back into your DCs with that same truck? And, back in those days, I won't say which years to date us, but in those days that was witchcraft, and primarily because organizationally they were siloed, and yet, the leading organizations saw the value and restructured to, now in transportation, the idea is to really create a control tower and control center to operate transportation effectively across a whole organization. OmniChannel, I think, is going to do the same thing. In order to break down those silos functionally from a software perspective, quite honestly, the software side isn't that hard. It's organizationally how do you get the traditional supply chain planners to think about, for example, the realities of the warehouse or the transportation folks, right? How do you break down those walls and have them think about those particular domains? I think the challenges that companies are facing are going to force that change as they need to drive efficiencies. But it's absolutely one that's critical to consider.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I think that, things like OmniChannel, I think are finally, serving as a catalyst to finally walk the talk on these things. And I think, in fairness, from a technology standpoint, I mean, you can argue that, a decade ago, even if you wanted to do it, the computing power and other pieces of it just weren't available, right? If you want to truly take this holistic analysis, it would take 24 hours to run type of thing, where it didn't work on an operational level. But obviously today, with cloud computing and with more advanced algorithms and things like that, that's making this more and more of a reality. We're running short on time here. I've got a couple of more questions. I just want to remind those of you that are watching live that if you do have a question for Fab, now would be the time to ask it. So let's look at some use cases or some examples. I mean, in your role, you get to work with a lot of companies that are kind of on this omni-channel journey and very active in this area. I mean, when you look at companies that you would consider kind of leading the way, what lessons can we learn from them?
Oh, you broke up a little bit, but I think I caught the end of the question. So what lessons? I think the key ones in some of the leading companies that I've worked with, and they tend to be, the bigger ones. So, in fairness, they do have, size and scale, which allow them to kind of look at things a little bit differently. But certainly, the thought processes are there. I think the big thing, in line with what we've talked about, is thinking, I think, twofold. One is thinking holistically, but starting with the customer. I mean, ultimately, the consumer now, that's the shift. Again, I'll use, retail as an example. Before, the customer was more about the demographic, and I was really planning to the store, right, and thinking about assortment and inventory allocation to the store. Now I'm really thinking about the individual consumer and how I'm going to service them and the different strategies there. And I think you have to work backwards from that, but you have to work all the way backwards to the supply chain. So I think that's one of the key learnings that I see is, and in particular, we've seen this certainly outside of North America in places like the UK where we've seen some pretty advanced strategies. It's about looking at, okay, what network do I have? What are the blocks or pieces that I can take advantage of, and what's the way to do it? As opposed to, again, the whole advent of the term omni-channel implied that there were these individual channels, and so people leaders are moving away from thinking e-commerce and store to my fulfillment methods to get to my consumer. And I think that the second part of that is much like we said before, this notion of one size doesn't fit all. There isn't an assumption that that you need to do and follow everything that everyone else does. You have to look at your own network, your own strengths, and see what makes sense and what's going to drive profitability, right? So that's the other factor that I think leading organizations really take those to heart and drive that through their strategies.
No, those are great points. I think to the last one there in terms of one size doesn't fit all, and I think what you're seeing some companies make the mistake is that they'll look to someone like Amazon and say we've got to do that, right? Meanwhile, that might not be where their strengths are. That might not be the most effective thing for them to do, and they may have other levers that they can pull to be just as competitive or be competitive in a different way. Than just trying to, copy what a competitor is doing. And I think, that's what I see as some of the mistakes that companies are making is that, it's, and particularly when it comes to Amazon, because they get such, a lot of publicity and they're always in the press, is kind of chasing, what others are doing rather than really taking a step back and really understanding, their network, their strengths, and ultimately looking at it from a longer term and a profitability, perspective. So as a way to wrap up, Fab, what questions should, supply chain logistics executives, ask themselves to assess their, logistics operations and capabilities, whether they're aligned with these new requirements and challenges associated with Omni-Channel, and what actions can they take today to start moving up the maturity curve?
Well, I think a couple of things. One is, and I think in line with what we just talked about, right? Really understanding your consumer, who your customer really is, and where they are and their characteristics, and kind of working backwards from that there. I think also, we say, look at things holistically. That's part of it. I think maybe another way of phrasing it is don't do things just because that's the way you've always done them. Don't, if I have to use a cliche or add a buzzword, be fearless, right? Don't be afraid about, in terms of breaking down a wall that's always been there that maybe really needs to be broken down, and foster that change. The reality, again, this is, it's really an exciting time to be in. Certainly for you and I as kind of practitioners or thought leaders, the amount of change has been incredible, and it's exciting, gives us a lot of cool things to talk about, but it also gives us a lot to think about in terms of where it could go. I think another thing is be innovative. I think the challenge with the maturity curve is that, maturity curves sometimes assume definitions, and I think in this world, there's a continuing evolution. You're going to have the Amazons of the world leading the charge or doing different things, but then you're going to have other competitors maybe do something a little different, and I think you're going to find people finding alternatives and creating even different ways. And with the advent of all the technology we have to bring to bear, I think you're going to see some interesting creativity because of the necessity. So certainly that fearlessness, I think is preeminent, and don't, as you said, I think the last thing is don't be necessarily a follower. Be, add that fearlessness to drive your own path if that's what makes sense for you.
All great points there and words of advice. Fab, I always say this at the end of all my episodes. We always just manage to scratch the surface and on the topics that we talk about. And certainly when it comes to Omni-Channel, you can have a whole conference, devoted to this topic. So, quite a challenge to try to do it within 30 or 40 minutes. But I think that we hit some great points and at least got the conversation started around the impact that Omni-Channel is having on logistics. So I want to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to be with us today.
Thank you very much for having me, Adrian. It's long overdue.
Great. And I want to thank all those of you that joined us live today. We didn't get any questions, but if you are watching this episode on demand and you've got a question for Fab, you can find this episode on talkinglogistics.com. And you can post a question or a comment there, and I'm sure that Fab will be more than happy to respond via that medium. So again, thank you all for joining us today, and look forward to seeing you in a future episode of Talking Logistics. Have a great day.